Hello, you are most welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Real Impartation Moment on Tuesday Night Anatomy with Daniel Open. Today's section, we quickly go through the nasal cavity. We want to look at the anatomy of the nasal cavity, some important bits. Yes, remember that the nose over there, yes, is not only for beautification of the face, but it will contain a cavity which will be relevant in conditioning of the air. Yes, within the same cavity, we have area for olfaction, for smelling. Okay, so it means that the nose is very important. And so, without much ado, yes, let's look at some important aspects of the nose. So there we are. Externally, you can see that the nose is a midline structure in the head region. Okay. Yes, people may present with different kinds, those with flat, ones, pointed ones, and what have you. But what I'm interested in is showing you is that, yes, over here we have two ala. Now, if you look at the nose, it's having two wings. Okay, so we have one on the left, one on the right. These are what we call the ali. Okay, the plural form of ala is ali. Okay, wings of what we call the nose. And they are flanging outside so that they give off these openings, and these openings are what we call the external nares, otherwise something we call the anterior nasal apertures. So we have what we call anterior nasal apertures over here, okay, otherwise what we call the nostrils. Okay, so in between, or separating these nostrils medially is what we call the nasal septum. We will see the nasal septum, the various components of the nasal septum. Now this is the upper lip. Now the upper lip bears what we call philtrum. Okay, there's that shallow depression over there. Okay, in the upper lip, in the midline. Okay, that is what we call philtrum. Now at the cranial portion, most portion of the philtrum, we see what we call columella. Okay, there's the correct spelling, columella. Okay, it's what you find over there. Okay, columella. So that is that one we find. Now one thing that you have to know is that the nose also bears this tip. Okay, so external you have the tip of the nose. Okay, and this tip of the nose can also be called what we call pronasally. Okay, pronasally is also known as what you call the tip of the nose. And then beyond that, we also have what you call the dorsum, or the dorsal aspect, the back portion of the nose. That's the dorsum of the nose. So there's the dorsum of the nose. And then beyond the dorsum of the nose, yes, we have what we call the root of the nose, which otherwise we call the radix. Okay, and we know that the radix, one important suture which is over there in the radix, is what we call the nasion. Okay, the frontal nasal suture which you find over there anteriorly is the nasion. Okay, and we know beyond the nasion, above you are having the glabella, that protuberance over there in the frontal bone. Okay, we are not going into that detail. But if I look at the ala of the nose, okay, the ala also bears some features which is shown over here. Yes, at the posterolateral aspect of the ala, I have the nasal ala crest. Nasal ala crest. Okay, the posterolateral aspect, I have the nasal ala crest. Then I have what you call, if I look at the anterior aspect of it, okay, the superior portion which is close to the tip, okay, I have what you call superior point of the nasal, of the nostril axis. Then at the lower portion, I have what you call the inferior point of what you call the nostril axis. Yes, these are some minor details that you can actually look at. Of course, we are not looking at the lip, so we will talk about other details, later. But one thing we find is that, this nose, okay, for instance, if I look at the radix, okay, it's very important that we have nasal bones over there, where of course we know that that's where the bridges of what we call the spectacles that we wear rests. Okay, so the nose is doing important things. Okay, that is one important thing. Then one thing that you have to know is that the bone, this nose, yes, apart from bone, okay, giving it that kind of support, we also have cartilages, and then apart from that, we also have what you call fatty tissue reinforcing or giving that kind of cushioning over there. So we don't have only bone, we have cartilages over there to make it actually flexible. Okay, to make it flexible. And that cartilage over there is, yes, essentially hyaline cartilage. So let's move on and see. So let's look at some bony aspects of what we call the nose. Of course, we know that there's the forehead, and the forehead will have the frontal bone, and then where the bridges of what we call the spectacles rest, okay, are the two bilateral nasal bones. So these are the nasal bones which lie on either side. So these are the nasal bones. We know medial to that one we have what we call the lacrimal bone. Yes, we are not going into that detail. And then if you have what we call the frontal process of the maxilla all over there, we are not going into that detail. Then, so that's the bony portion. Now the remaining portions are cartilages. Okay, so what we find over here is that, yes, on either side, so laterally. So that's why we call it lateral process of septal nasal cartilages. So we have what we call nasal septum, and it gives up these lateral processes. So simply we can call them lateral nasal cartilages. Lateral nasal cartilages. So that is the what do you call it? Lateral nasal cartilages. Okay, on the dorsal aspect of what we call. So it means that in the radix or the root of the nose essentially is bony. Okay, deep to the skin. Okay, we have that's a bone component. Okay, it's bone. But in the dorsal aspect, we have what we call the lateral, what we call processes coming from the septal cartilage. Okay, I'll show you the septal cartilage. Okay, but essentially you can simply call it the lateral, nasal cartilages. Okay, in the dorsal aspect of the nose. Then apart from that, if I get to the tip, okay, and then also flanging to the ala or the wings of the nose, I have what we call the major ala, cartilage. Yes, major ala cartilage. And this major ala cartilage, yes, is having two, leg-like processes. One is towards the lateral aspect, okay, and that's why we are calling it ala. Okay, so this one is called the lateral cruise of it. And they also have the one who is closer to the midline of the body being the medial cruise, and that is what we call the major ala cartilage. Major ala cartilage. Okay, so now one thing that I want you to know about this major ala cartilage here is that if I look at the lateral cruise, okay, the lateral cruise of it, and then combined, okay, looking at the lateral, what do you call process coming from the septal nasal septal cartilage, okay. What is happening is that between them, there's this cartilage over there, this little cartilage over here, which we call them accessory nasal cartilages. So we have accessory nasal cartilages sandwiched between, of course, the lateral nasal cartilages, and of course, the major ala cartilage, the lateral, cruise of the major ala cartilage. Then, posterolateral to what we call the major ala cartilage, I have what we call the minor ala cartilage. I have the minor ala cartilage. So these are important cartilages over here, okay, give the nose that kind of flexibility. Then even on the ala, lower portion of the ala, I have this, this kind of fatty tissue over here. Okay, fibro fatty tissue over here. And all these ones are giving that kind of support to, of course, the nose. Of course, we know that the lower portion, we have the maxilla, and maxilla will have this process over here, okay, which of course we call it the, the nasal spine, And this nasal spine, yes, of course, will be covered. Okay, eventually it will be covered. So that is, what I want you to know over here. Now, we've seen that if I want to enter the nose, okay, then what will happen is that if I want to enter the chambers of the nose, then what will happen is that I'm having the external openings, and they are what you call the external nares, otherwise called nostrils, otherwise called anterior nasal aperture. So these anterior nasal apertures will allow air, okay, from the external environment to come in or bring, exhaled air out of the nasal cavity. Okay, that is one thing we find. Now, one important thing is that once I enter the nasal cavity, I will take you through some bit of the nasal cavity. Once I enter the nasal cavity, what I find is that if I'm leaving the nasal cavity, there's another thing which we call it the posterior nasal aperture. And this posterior nasal aperture, yes, you can see from the base of the skull where the sphenoid air sinus, okay, is all the way to what we call the soft palate, that area, okay, leading. So beyond this area, I have the pharynx. Okay, so this area I'm having the pharynx, the nasal pharynx. Okay, so this is the posterior extent of the nasal cavity. We call it Choanae, or you also call it posterior nasal aperture, or what we call internal nares. Okay, that is what we find over here. Now, over here, I'm looking at the medial wall of the nasal cavity. So if I take a cross section, okay, going through so that I cut through and then expose, I want to see the medial wall of this nasal cavity. So I said that each of these, so we have two nasal cavities, yes, and each of these nasal cavities will have lateral wall and medial wall. Now I'm interested in the medial wall for now. This medial wall, okay, is having what we call a septum. And that is what we call nasal septum. This medial wall is the septum, nasal septum. And this nasal septum is made up of two bones, okay? So the superior portion, now you know that this is the, yes, you know the skull is here, okay? This is the skull, and therefore this cranial cavity is over here, okay? and you know there is sphenoid. Therefore, the bone anterior to sphenoid will be ethmoid, and this ethmoid gives off a perpendicular plate. So this, I mean, color over here, this one is shown over here, is the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid. Perpendicular plate of the ethmoid. Okay, that is superior portion. Then from the inferior aspect, we have what you call the vomer. Now, this is a vomer. This is a vomer. So this is a vomer. Now the vomer is a solitary, you know, one single bone, which is part of what we call the facial bones. Okay, so that is what we call the vomer. So the vomer meets the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid to form the bony component of the nasal septum. And then in the 11, these two bones are reinforced by this cartilage, which we call the septal cartilage. Okay, so it means that nasal septum, we are having 3 components. We are having the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid, come from the ethmoid bone, going downwards, meeting vomer from the inferior aspect, reinforced in the 11 by what we call the nasal septal cartilage. Yes, for that matter. Okay, so that is what I want you to know. Now, when I look at the lateral wall of the nasal cavity, the bones over there, okay, still this one will contribute to it. Okay, so on the lateral wall, we are having these bones. Still this is the sphenoid bone, sphenoidal air sinus over here, and therefore anterior to it, I'm going to have what you call the ethmoid. And this ethmoid, one important thing, apart from providing us, okay, going through the medial aspect, being what we call the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid, is also giving us these shelf-like structures, okay, over here. And these things are what we call, this is the superior and this is the middle nasal concha. These bony structures over here. So this is the superior nasal concha, and this is what we call middle nasal concha. Now sometimes there could be another one even coming above this, what we call superior nasal concha, and that's what we call the supreme or the highest nasal concha of the ethmoid. Okay, so usually you want to see 3, but sometimes, yes, you are going to see 3. There's a third one I'm going to talk about. But those ones which are directly coming from what we call the ethmoid, there are 2 usually. We have the superior and we have the middle nasal concha. But sometimes some individuals may present with another one which is even superior to what we call the superior nasal concha, and that's what we call supreme or the highest nasal concha of the ethmoid. Yes, all these ones are coming from the ethmoid. And then there's another one over here where it's a separate bone on its own, okay, and they are bilateral. That is what we call inferior nasal concha. Okay, and that is why out of these 3 or 4 concha, the largest concha is the inferior nasal concha, because they are those ones which are separate bones on their own. The superior, middle, and sometimes the supreme, they are part of what we call the ethmoid bone, and therefore the smallest one will be the supreme if it is there. The intermediate one will be the middle, okay, and then followed by the middle, and then eventually get to what we call the middle nasal concha. Okay, so that is what we find. So, but one thing I want you to know is that in between these ones, I'll show you that in between. Okay, let me even use something else to show you. These are what we call the nasal concha. Now, the interesting thing is that some people tend to, use the word turbinate for it. Yes, we can use them, interchangeably. They are synonymous. However, there's a thin line between them, because in the 11, these concha that I showed you, the superior nasal concha, middle nasal concha, and inferior nasal concha, in the 11, there's mucous membrane covering them. Okay, so that on the superior nasal concha, because it's very close to the ethmoid, and the ethmoid has this perforated plate. Okay, this horizontal plate, where you call it the cribriform plate, will send axons from what we call the olfactory bulb, okay, to reach this area. And that's why this portion is very important. This mucosa over here will be olfactory mucosa, important for what you call it, smelling, okay, for smelling, okay. But the lower portion will have respiratory epithelium, okay, so that it can help condition the air, removing particulate matter and all that, okay, this portion. Okay, so I said that in 11 they will be covered by mucous membrane. This one will have olfactory mucosa, and this one, this area will have what you call the respiratory mucosa. So if I'm having these concha, okay, covered by mucous membrane, ensuring that they cause turbulence in the air, while the air, okay, for effective, smelling to take place in case if the upper portion, or for air conditioning, yes, that is what we call, they become what we call turbinate, because they cause turbulence in the air that is coming over. They whirl the air, okay, so that there will be enough surface area, okay, for this kind of area to ensure that particulate matter are removed. Okay, so that is one thing that I want you to actually know over here. Now, one thing that we know, yes, okay, so that is fine. This is what I want you to know. Now, another thing that I want to tell you is that, now you see, this is the nasal cavity, this is the posterior nasal aperture. So it means that if you are eating, okay, and then sometimes if, let's say, a portion of the food wants to come here, then what will happen is that this thing, where the uvula or the soft palate, will have to come over here all the way to close the posterior entry into the nasal cavity. Now, one thing that is very important is that the mucous membrane of the nose is highly, vascularized. Okay, one thing is very important, that is highly vascularized. Now, over here, we have an area we call Little's area. Okay, so in the lateral wall of the nasal cavity, we have this Little's area. Please get to know that Little's area. And this Little's area, what we see is that we see what we call the Kieselbeck's plexus. Okay, Kieselbeck's plexus. And this Kieselbeck's plexus, yes, is mainly formed by about 5, okay, blood vessels anastomosis in this region. And it makes sense, you can make it out, the names of these blood vessels. And that is why this area is very prone to what we call epistaxis. Yes, your nose may be bleeding. Yes, because, of course, when this, Kieselbeck's plexus, yes, the step, they get injured, yes, then you'll be bleeding, through your nose. And what are the tributaries? Sorry, what are the blood vessels which are contributing to this Kieselbeck's plexus? And from the ethmoid, okay, ethmoid will have, give off this kind of anterior ethmoidal artery. It also give off posterior ethmoidal artery. Yes, from this area. Apart from that, you know that the upper lip is also very close to this area, and therefore the upper lip will also give off a branch, and that branch is what we call the superior, labial artery. Okay, meeting over here. Then apart from that, yes, from the palate, yes, we have what we call the greater palatine artery, which will go through what we call the nasopalatine foramen, yes, also coming over here. Okay, and then we also have the sphenoid. Now the blood vessel is moving all the way from the sphenoid bone, yes, also coming across what we call the palatine bone, so that's why I call it sphenopalatine artery. All these 5 blood vessels are anastomosing over here in this little area. That is why this area is prone to epistaxis. Alright, so as I told you, as I enter the nasal cavity, you may smell something, okay, but eventually, yes, although we have these turbinates over here, it wants to go to a superior turbinate because we have olfactory mucosa over there, and because over there we have axons coming from the olfactory bulb. There's olfactory tract, okay, there's olfactory bulb, and axons coming all the way this way. These are the fila olfactoria, okay, the axons of what we call the cranial nerve 1, olfactory nerve, okay, reaching what we call the olfactory mucosa, okay, to receive that kind of sensation and send it to the brain, okay, for that kind of interpretation. Okay, all right, so that is one thing that you have to know. But over here we are going to have rather respiratory mucosa, pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium with goblet cells, helping to well condition the air. So if we are not looking at the histology, but just to give you a small hint, one thing is that if I look at the olfactory epithelium, okay, what we find is that there will be important things. These important things are what we call the olfactory cells, and these olfactory cells will bear some receptors. Okay, some cilia will be over there. Okay, will bear those kind of receptors, or those olfactory hair cells. Okay, these cells are actually bipolar neurons. Okay, they will send the those fibers eventually going through the cribriform plates, okay, of what we call the ethmoid into the olfactory bulb, through the olfactory tract, eventually get into the brain for interpretation. Now these cells are supported, and that's why you have what we call sustentacular cells. These are the supporting cells. These are columnar cells, okay, and they are going to be very important in supporting them. Now studies have shown that yes, this coronavirus, which was found in 2019, COVID-19 virus, is able to cause destruction of these supporting cells, okay, and that may lead to some diminished sense of smell. Okay, so one of those complications is anosmia in this kind of COVID-19. Now sometimes even the olfactory mucosa may be covered with mucus. Okay, if you have cold, that's why your sense of smell may go down, because what is happening is that if you have cold, let me just go back briefly. What will happen is that the mucus may get over here, and therefore, yes, receiving that kind of sensation may become very poor. Okay, so that is, that one for you. And then apart from that, we also have that kind of regenerative cells. Okay, they are what we call the basal cells. They are the stem cells which will give rise, differentiate to give us either the supporting cells or the neuroepithelial cells, being of course the olfactory cells bearing these kind of hair cells. Okay, so that is what I want you to actually know over here. Now one point is that I told you that the nose is highly vascular, the nasal cavity is highly vascularized. That is why it looks very pinkish. Can you see that in the leaven? It looks very pinkish because membrane, because highly vascularized. Okay, that is one thing I want to show you. But over here, that is what I want to show you. If I want to enter the nasal cavity, actually, yes, so there's the external nares. There's the what we call it. There's the external nasal aperture, otherwise known as anterior nares, and then there's the posterior nasal aperture, the choana. What I find is that as I enter the nasal cavity, where I see hair, okay, that is the vestibule of the nasal cavity. The vestibule of the nasal cavity. Nasal cavity, the vestibule will have what you call the coarse hair over there, the vibrissae. Then beyond vestibule, this is what we call the nasal cavity proper. This area is called nasal cavity proper. Now there's a landmark which is helping us distinguish between the vestibule and the nasal cavity proper, and that's this rich light structure we find over here. Okay, or that margin that we find over here, elevator structure over here, and that is what we call nasal limen, L-I-M-E-N, nasal limen. Okay, now if I want to enter the nasal cavity proper, there's the nasal cavity proper, where I see these turbinates being here, then what will happen is that I find this area without a turbinate, which is serving as the inflow chamber. Okay, inflow, where the air which is coming through into the nasal cavity, okay, we have to traverse before they get into the whirling area, the turbulent areas, and that is what we call the atrium. Remember that if you look at the heart, the receiving chambers or the inlet chambers of the heart are the atria. So the nose also has atrium, okay, or is having this kind of atria to receive that kind of air, okay, before it enters where we have to cause turbulence to it. Okay, so these are the turbinates. This is the atrium, okay, of the nasal cavity proper, and this is where we have the the turbinates of the nasal cavity proper. Now when I come here, I find what you call the superior nasal turbinates, middle, and of course inferior nasal turbinates, for they are covered by mucous membrane. And then beneath each of them, so for instance beneath superior nasal concha, turbinates, and for that matter between superior and middle nasal turbinate, I find a meatus over here, and that's what we call the superior nasal meatus. Yes, similarly below superior nasal turbinate, and for that matter between superior and middle nasal turbinate, I find what we call the middle nasal meatus. And then yes, below what we call inferior nasal turbinate, and for that matter between inferior nasal turbinate and the superior portion of the palate, I find what we call the inferior nasal meatus over here. Okay, so that is what I find. Now there's another thing that I want to show you. Now there is something over here, there's another recess over here, and this time around, this I told you, this is the sphenoidal air sinus, okay, between the sphenoid, okay, the body of the sphenoid, and what we call the cribriform plate of what we call the ethmoid. I find another recess over there, and that's why we want to call that recess phenoethmoidal recess. Okay, that phenoethmoidal recess is bringing what we call this the mucus, okay, in what we call the sphenoidal air sinus, into what we call this area. So because it's very close to it, so it goes this way. Okay, so that is that one. Now if I look at superior, okay, this one, where is the superior nasal meatus? Okay, I'll show you that one. Yeah, there's the ethmoid. Now ethmoid is rather having ethmoidal air cells, which are grouped into what we call anterior, middle, and of course posterior. The posterior one will be coming this way. Now I have to show you in a better picture so that I can appreciate this one very well. But of course the anterior and middle are coming into the what we call middle meatus. I'll show you better in a better image. Now, the interesting thing is that in the what we call the middle meatus, a lot of things are taking place here, because even the maxillary sinus is also draining here, the frontal sinus is also draining here. Okay, and I'll show you other things. Now, I will remove this one to show you something deep to this, elevation in the middle nasal, turbinate, and that is what we call the, I'll show you the bulla ethmoidalis, I'll show you the hiatus terminalis, and at its anterior portion bearing the infundibulum, I'll show you that one. Then at the inferior nasal concha, that's why when we cry, yes, there's that connection between, of course, the lacrimal sac, okay, the medial aspect, okay, in line the lacrimal fossa via this nasolacrimal duct to what we call the nasal cavity, and it's coming all the way into the inferior nasal meatus. And that's why we know that when we cry, sometimes we see that, yes, our nasal cavity, yes, some fluid be dripping out of it. Okay, so that is that one that I want you to know. Okay, so you can see that at the roof, you see that the nasal cavity, the base of the skull, is doing that for us. So not only the frontal bone, okay, if you look at the roof of the nasal cavity, the frontal bone is contributing, the ethmoid is contributing, okay, cribriform plate. Okay, as I come to the posterior aspect of the roof, I see the body of the sphenoid, okay, in that manner. And then the floor, yes, is by the superior portion of the palate, forming what we call the floor of the nasal cavity. So let's see. So as I said, now we have what we call, these sinuses. So these are the mucous membrane filled areas which tend to lighten the skull, and they also help to serve as resonating chambers of sound. Okay, these are what we call the sinuses. They are called paranasal sinuses because they are adjacent what we call the nose, the nasal cavity. They are called paranasal sinuses. Okay, so that is one thing that I want you to know. But of course, we know that the largest paranasal sinus is what we call the maxillary sinus. Okay, and it will be followed by what we call the sphenoidal sinus, then frontal sinus, then eventually we get to what we call the ethmoidal air cells. Okay, they are all adjacent. They have to eventually drain their content into what we call the nasal cavity. So let's look at how this kind of drainage and all that happens. So I told you that if you look over here, okay, this is what we call the what is the name? Superior, nasal turbinate. Okay, and therefore we said that above the superior nasal turbinate, okay, between what we call the sphenoid and the ethmoid, there's a recess, and that is what we call what? What we call the superior, what is the name? It's called sphenoethmoidal, recess, and that is where the sphenoidal, air sinus would drain its content into. Okay, because it's very proximal to it. Okay, that's the logic behind it. Now, if I take, now there's the ethmoid also bears what you call, it will have anterior, okay, middle, and posterior, okay, ethmoidal air cells. The posterior one is very close here, so it is draining directly into what we call superior meatus, over here, into superior meatus. Then I told you that in the middle meatus, okay, I've removed what we call the, what's the name? You've taken what we call the middle, nasal, what do you call turbinates over there, and for that matter, we see this elevation over here, which labeled as number 2. That is the bulla ethmoidalis. Now remember that just beneath below ethmoidalis, there's an opening over there, and that is what we call hiatus semilunaris. Yes, it has this kind of lunar appearance, semilunaris. And then anterior to the hiatus semilunaris, okay, I have what we call the infundibulum. Now remember, I told you that in the middle meatus, that is where a lot of things are opening into. So if I look at the what we call the frontal sinus, yes, it's opening into what we call the middle meatus. But this time where? Into what we call the infundibular portion, Yes, if I look at what we call the what's the name? Anterior ethmoidal sinus, okay, as well as if I look at what we call so if you look at the anterior ethmoidal sinus, yes, apart from the maxillary sinus draining into the anterior, what we call the infundibular portion, even the anterior ethmoidal sinus also opening there, okay, eventually gets into the hiatus semilunaris. But opening directly on what we call the bulla ethmoidalis is the middle meatus. So anterior this way, okay, middle this way, makes sense. Posterior this way, So if you can look at what I'm doing, yeah, the posterior is very close here, so it's opening directly into the middle meatus, middle nasal meatus. Yes, we are saying that anterior and middle are opening into what we call the middle meatus, but the anterior is opening into what we call alongside the maxillary sinus. They are both opening into what you call the infundibular portion. Okay, then the middle one is opening directly onto what we call the bulla ethmoidalis. So that is what we see. Then the one which you don't see over here, that's the maxillary sinus, will be opening into what you call directly into what we call hiatus semilunaris. So it makes sense. That's how God designed it to be. Now if I look at what we call the inferior meatus, I told you that one important thing, that is the connection between, of course, the lacrimal sac, and what we call the nasal cavity via the nasolacrimal duct, so that tears during when you are crying, it could be. And that also makes sense, that is why when you apply eye drop, yes, it can trickle down all the way and it gets into your nasal cavity and even get into your throat, and you may feel that kind of the bitterness or whatever it is. So that is how it is. So that's what we've said already. Yes, all these are the openings. We've seen that we have the concha. Now I've removed the superior nasal concha. So in simple terms, sphenoethmoidal recess, yes, is the opening. We'll give passage for what we call the sphenoidal air sinus to get in there. Then if I look at the superior meatus, yes, of course, the posterior ethmoidal air sinus is going there. If I look at the what is the name, the middle meatus, then what will happen is that we are going to see it will contain the bulla. The bulla will receive the middle ethmoidal air cells. If I look at the infundibulum, it will receive the anterior ethmoidal air cells together with the maxillary air cells. Then if I look at the hiatus semilunaris itself, it will receive the maxillary air sinus. Then if I come to what we call the inferior meatus, then one important thing, the nasolacrimal duct. All right, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you find it helpful. Stay tuned for the other important aspects of your anatomy. Have a good night, all of you, and may the good Lord richly bless you. Amen.